1.6 extension. So this is out of our book. I am on page 42 in big green. And the extension is adding and subtracting fractions. So you have to remember that you can add and subtract fractions with unlike denominators by writing equivalent fractions with a common denominator. And one way to do this is by multiplying the numerator and the denominator of each fraction by the denominator of the other fraction. Just as a quick review too, when we're talking about numerators and denominators, remember if I have a fraction like 1/2, this top number is my numerator and this bottom number is my denominator. So just make sure you remember that as we go on. Example 1, adding fractions using a common denominator. So if we're trying to find 5/8 plus 1/6, what we're going to do is rewrite the fractions with a common denominator, and we're going to use the product of the denominators as the common denominator. So 5/5 plus 1/6, what it would look like is we're going to take and multiply the 8 times 6. So it will really look like this, 8 times 6 over, remember, whatever I do to the bottom, I have to do it to the top. So I had 5, and I'm going to multiply that by 6. Okay? So that's what's going to get me my new fraction. Sometimes I like to just write it like this, though. 5/5 I just say times 6, and then I'm going to multiply the top by 6. So what that's going to do to this fraction is it's going to take 6 times 5 is 30, and then I have 6 times 8, and it equals 48. So that becomes my new fraction. If I do the same thing over here with the 1/6, I'm going to take and multiply it by 8. So I'll have 6 times 8, and I'll have 1 times 8. So in other words, if I'm doing it the same way I just showed you over here, now I have my 1/6, and multiply that by 8, multiply that by 8. So like I said, it's easier for me to visualize it looking at it like, get my pointer, looking at it like this, because I can say, okay, I'm doing it to the bottom, I'm going to do it to the top. And what I end up getting with that is, let me get my pencil back here, I get 8 over 48. So now, I think the main thing here is that I have 48 as my denominators, okay? And my numerators are obviously different still, but however, the point is that my denominators are now common, and that's what I'm trying to do. So let me make this all a little bit smaller, and now I just want to show you one more time. So if I have 5/8 plus 1/6, I want to find the common denominator by using those two numbers on the base, or my denominator, to show you that I can multiply them together. So it's going to equal and look like this. So if I take 8 times 6, whatever I do to the bottom, I do to the top. So 5 times 6. Do the same thing over here, only I'm multiplying it by 8. Got to do it to the top. And the reason I chose 8 and 6 is because all I did was I took this number 6 comes from here. This number 8 comes from here. So now I just multiply them out. I've got 6 times 5 is 30. 6 times 8 is 48. Plus 1 times 8 is 8. And 6 times 8 is 48. And what that does, I'm going to make this one smaller again. And what that does is it gives me 30 over 48 plus 8 over 48. And when you add fractions together, all you're simply doing is going straight across on the top and leaving the same denominator. So 30 plus 8 equals 38. And now I have 38 over 48. Well, what we have to remember is our divisibility rules, and if I can find a number or a factor that goes into both numbers, a common factor, then I have to simplify it. So I can already tell you, because I know that these are both even numbers, that 2 can go into them. So I should be able to divide them both out by 2. 38 divided by 2 equals 19. 48 divided by 2 equals 24. You're going to have to learn very quickly that you need to put things in simplest terms. So adding fractions using a common denominator, my answer ends up being 19/24. The least common denominator, or LCD, not to be confused with least common multiple, but the least common denominator of 2 or more fractions is the least common multiple of the denominators. So this can help and provide another method for adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators. So the good news is if we do it this method, then what happens is we don't have to do any simplifying. We'll find the simplest term. Example 2, adding fractions using the LCD. So what we're going to do is we're going to find the LCD of the denominators. We have the same exact problem we had before. We have 5/8 plus 1/6. So now we're going to work on finding the LCM of those denominators. So we're going to list the multiples of 8, and then we're going to list the multiples of 6. So basically we're just finding the LCM, or the least common multiple, of 8 and 6. So it would look something like this. Now that I've listed out the factors, or several factors, of each of these numbers, now I'm going to look for ones that are similar, or the same. So I've got 8, 6, get a pointer, 8, 6, I got 12, 16, 18. So obviously my first ones that match are 24. So I'm going to take and just put a box around 24 for now. And I keep going through my list here. 32, 30, 40, 36, 48, 42. I also have 48 here. So obviously that is a common multiple of the 2. But now what I'm trying to find is the least common multiple of the 2. And it actually happens to be 24, because that's my least number possible. So basically what that is doing is it's changing and helping me find the least common denominator. So it's going to change my denominator. So my new problem is going to look like this. I'm going to have 24 on the bottom, plus this one's going to have 24. And I'm going to redo my my original problem to make it so it turns into this common denominator. So now you need to think of what the factor pair is that equals my 5/8 and my 1/6 to get me to the 24th. So I'm going to actually start a new page here. So if you, actually I can just make it smaller. So if I start with 5/8 plus 1/6, it equals, I want to have 24 on the bottom, because I know that that's an LCD, or least common denominator of the 2 numbers. I have to ask myself, how did I get from 8 to 24, and from 6 to 24? So what I need to think about is, okay, what times 8 equals 24? Well, we should know that 8 times 3 equals 24. So whatever you do on the bottom, you have to do on the top. So if 3 times 8 equals 24, 3 times 5 equals 15. Do the same thing over here with my 24. 6 times what equals 24? 6 times 4 does. Well, 6 times 4 equals 24. You do the same thing on the top and you multiply it by the 4. 1 times 4 is 4. And now I have a common denominator. 15 plus 4 is 19. Now if you go back and look at our previous example, we simplified and got 19/24. Doing this route, we do not need to simplify. It simplifies it for us, which is ultimately where we want to go. Eventually, if you don't simplify your fractions, I end up marking you off half a point, and to the point where I do mark you off a full point. So you want to really make sure that you're focusing on this. So finding the LCD is the quickest way to go. You don't always have to do this route either. You can do your factor trees And we could have done a factor tree of 8 and a factor tree of 6 and did the prime factorization to figure out what our least common denominator is. So either way. All right, here's a couple triads for you. One thing I want to point out is that when you're doing subtraction, it's the same exact thing as doing addition. You're only subtracting the top two, but you can't do it until you find the same common denominator. So work on that. Use either example 1 or example 2 to try it out, and then your answers will be below in just a minute. So make sure you pause it right now before you find the answer. All right, these are answers. One thing I want to point out is it needs to be in a mixed number, not left in the improper fraction. So if you're not really sure how to do that, I'll do a review with you at another time. And that's it.